3 weeks ago, a construction crew in Siberia broke through a layer of permafrost and discovered something that wasn't supposed to exist. Within hours, the site was seized by military forces. The workers were detained, their phones confiscated, their families threatened into silence. But one photo escaped, a single image that's been spreading through encrypted channels, causing panic in the highest levels of power across multiple governments. It shows a structure, a building, perfectly preserved beneath centuries of ice, a building that, according to every history book, every academic institution, every official record, was never built. Because the civilization that created it never existed. Except it did, and one person knew exactly where to find it. Anastasia Volkov died in 1952, taking what everyone assumed were the ramblings of a senile old woman to her grave. But her grandson kept a secret, a recording, a map, and a warning: they will come looking for this. And when they do, the world will have to choose between comfortable lies and dangerous truths. That moment has arrived. The excavation in Siberia isn't random. Someone decoded Anastasia's final message, and what they're uncovering, beneath the ice, could shatter the foundation of everything we've been taught about human history. But here's the question nobody's asking. If Anastasia knew where this city was hidden, what else did she know? And what was the one secret so dangerous she refused to put it on tape? In the spring of 2022, a 90-year-old man named Mikhail Volkov began sending encrypted emails to researchers around the world. The emails contained fragments of a story, pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, described an impossible conspiracy spanning over a century. Most recipients deleted the messages as spam. A few were intrigued but skeptical. But 3 people, an architect in Berlin, a physicist in Tokyo, and a historian in Boston, recognized something in those fragments. Something that aligned with anomalies they'd each independently discovered in their own fields. Within 6 months, they'd assembled in a secure location to listen to something that had been hidden for 70 years. A tape recording made in 1952 in a Prague nursing home. The voice on the tape belonged to an elderly woman speaking a mixture of Russian and something else, a language that took weeks to partially translate. Her name was Anastasia Volkov. She claimed to be 90 years old. She claimed to be the last surviving member of a civilization that was erased from history. And she claimed to know where the proof was buried. The 3 researchers spent 18 months verifying her story, cross-referencing historical records, analyzing architectural evidence, studying old maps and photographs. What they found terrified them. Because Anastasia wasn't lying, and the biggest secret, the one thing she whispered to her grandson in her final breath, the one thing he never included in the recordings, has just been confirmed. In Siberia, beneath the ice, they've found it, and now the race is on to control what comes next. Before we reveal what Anastasia knew, what she hid, and what's being uncovered right now in the Siberian wilderness, make sure you're subscribed to this channel with notifications turned on. We're tracking this story in real time, and what happens in the next few weeks could change everything. You don't want to miss what's coming. Now let's go back to where it all started. A deathbed confession that was 70 years ahead of its time. The recording that changed everything. The tape hisses with the static of age. Mikhail Volkov's voice, young and uncertain, asks his grandmother if she's comfortable. There's a pause, then Anastasia speaks, her voice thin but sharp as a blade. Comfort is for those who have time. I have truth. Listen carefully because I will not repeat this. What follows is 3 hours of testimony that, when it first circulated among the 3 researchers in 2023, seemed like elaborate historical fiction. Anastasia describes a world that existed in the 19th century, a vast civilization spanning continents, possessing technological knowledge that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 21st century, building structures that modern engineers still cannot fully explain. But it was the specificity that caught their attention. She didn't speak in vague generalities or mystical terms. She provided dates, names, locations. She described architectural techniques with the precision of someone who'd watched them being employed. She referenced documents that, when the researchers investigated, did exist in obscure archives. Documents that had been dismissed as forgeries or errors, but which corroborated her timeline exactly. Dr. Sarah Chen, the physicist from Tokyo, was the first to recognize something crucial in Anastasia's testimony. She's describing resonance frequency architecture, Chen explained to her colleagues. She's talking about buildings designed to interact with the Earth's electromagnetic field. And she's doing it in 1952, decades before we had the instruments to measure what she's describing. The architectural details Anastasia provided were cross-referenced by Klaus Hoffmann, the Berlin architect. He spent months analyzing historical photographs of buildings from the late 1800s, structures officially attributed to various architects and time periods. The mathematical ratios are identical, Hoffmann discovered. Buildings supposedly constructed by completely different cultures in different eras, using different architectural traditions, all share the same underlying geometric principles that Anastasia describes in her testimony. But it was Dr. Marcus Webb, the historian from Boston, who found the most disturbing evidence, buried in census records, immigration documents, and regional archives across Eastern Europe and Central Asia. He discovered a pattern. Entire populations disappeared between 1870 and 1900, Webb documented. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. The official explanations are disease, economic migration, ethnic conflicts. But when you map the disappearances, they all correspond to regions Anastasia identifies as Tartarian strongholds. The three researchers realized they had something unprecedented, a first-hand testimony from someone claiming to be the last survivor of an erased civilization, backed by physical evidence that couldn't be easily dismissed. But the record, had a problem. It was incomplete. At several points in the testimony, Anastasia stops mid-sentence. The tape contains obvious edits, moments where Mikhail clearly paused the recording. And near the end, there's a section where Anastasia's voice drops to barely a whisper, and Mikhail can be heard saying, "Should I turn off the recorder for this?" The tape goes silent for 17 minutes. When it resumes, Anastasia sounds exhausted, and the conversation has clearly moved on to other topics. What was discussed in those 17 minutes? Mikhail Volkov, when finally contacted by the researchers, was reluctant to discuss it. My grandmother made me promise not to reveal certain things until the time was right, he explained. She said there was information that, if released prematurely, would be used to discredit everything else. Information that would only be believed when it could be verified. The researchers pressed him, but Mikhail held firm. She told me where something was hidden, something that would prove everything. She said when it was found, not if, but when, then I would know the time had come to release the rest. 3 months after that conversation, satellite imagery detected an anomaly in a remote region of Siberia. Thermal scans showed a massive structure beneath the permafrost, a structure with a heat signature that suggested it was still generating energy after being buried for over a century. A private excavation team was assembled. They began drilling in January 2024, and in March they broke through. The photo that leaked showed the top of a dome, copper and crystal, perfectly preserved, covered in the same geometric patterns Anastasia had described. The same patterns that appeared in buildings across the world, buildings officially attributed to dozens of different architects and cultures. The excavation team had found a Tartarian structure, intact, exactly where Anastasia had said it would be, and that's when Mikhail Volkov finally agreed to reveal what his grandmother had whispered to him in those final 17 minutes. What he told the researchers made them realize that the buried city in Siberia wasn't the biggest secret. It was just the key to unlocking something far more dangerous, the secret Anastasia couldn't record. Mikhail Volkov agreed to meet with the three researchers in person, but only under strict conditions. No digital devices, no phones, no computers. They met in a cabin in the Swiss Alps, completely off-grid, in February 2024, 1 month before the Siberian discovery became public. My grandmother made me swear I wouldn't write this down, Mikhail began, his 92-year-old hands trembling slightly as he spoke. She said the written word could be found, stolen, distorted. But memory passed from person to person. That's harder to corrupt, so I'm going to tell you what she told me, exactly as she said it. And then you'll understand why she was so afraid. The three researchers leaned in, recording devices off, notebooks set aside, committing themselves to becoming living vessels of this testimony. Anastasia told me that Tartaria wasn't destroyed because of what it was, Mikhail said. It was destroyed because of what it was becoming. She said that in the 1860s, the Tartarian knowledge keepers made a discovery, something that went beyond free energy, beyond advanced architecture. He discovered how to access what she called the field of collective consciousness. Dr. Chen interrupted. "I'm sorry, what does that mean?" Mikhail held up a hand. "Let me finish." She explained it like this. The human brain operates on electromagnetic frequencies. Thoughts, memories, consciousness itself, these are all electromagnetic phenomena. The Tartarian structures weren't just energy generators, they were consciousness amplifiers. When groups of people gathered in these buildings, their individual consciousnesses would synchronize, creating a collective field that was greater than the sum of its parts. She said this allowed for instantaneous communication across vast distances, not through technology as we understand it, but through direct mind-to-mind connection. It allowed for accelerated learning because knowledge could be transferred directly from teacher to student without the limitations of language. It allowed for rapid technological advancement because inventors could tap into a shared pool of innovation and insight. Klaus Hoffmann was skeptical. "This sounds like mysticism, not history." "That's what everyone would say," Mikhail nodded. "That's exactly why she didn't include it in the recording. But she told me that the Tartarian elders understood something crucial. This technology, this ability, was emerging naturally as human consciousness evolved. The buildings didn't create the ability, they just facilitated it, made it stronger, more reliable. Without the buildings, humans still had the capacity, but it was dormant, unreliable, dismissed as intuition or coincidence. And that," Mikhail said, his voice dropping, "was what terrified the powers that destroyed Tartaria. Not the free energy that was concerning, but manageable. No, they were terrified of a population that could communicate directly, that could share knowledge instantaneously, that could coordinate actions without needing hierarchical control structures. How do you rule over people who can read your intentions? How do you maintain secrets when consciousness itself is becoming networked?" Dr. Webb asked the obvious question, "So what happened?" "The knowledge keepers realized they were being targeted," Mikhail continued. "By the late 1860s, they knew that forces were moving against them, forces that wanted to suppress not just their technology but the evolutionary leap in consciousness that their technology was facilitating. So they made a desperate decision. They would hide their most advanced structure, a massive complex that served as the nexus of the entire consciousness network. They would bury it, intact, with all its technology preserved and functional. And they would encode its location in a way that could only be understood when human consciousness had evolved to the point where the information couldn't be suppressed anymore. The location wasn't hidden in maps or documents," Mikhail explained. "It was hidden in a frequency, a specific electromagnetic pattern that the human brain could detect and decode, but only when it reached a certain level of development. Anastasia possessed this frequency. She carried it in her mind her entire life, unable to fully access it herself, but knowing that she was a carrier, a bridge between the old world and whatever would come next." The three researchers sat in stunned silence. Finally, Dr. Chen spoke. "You're saying she had coordinates encoded in her brain as some kind of electromagnetic pattern?" "Not coordinates exactly," Mikhail corrected. "More like a resonance signature. She said that when enough humans started waking up to their latent abilities, when enough people started questioning the official narratives and seeking deeper truths, a critical mass would be reached. At that point, sensitive individuals would start experiencing the same dreams, the same visions, all pointing to the same location. The collective consciousness would essentially triangulate the position of the buried complex. And that," Mikhail said, pulling out a folder, "is exactly what happened." He showed them printouts of social media posts, blog entries, and forum discussions from 2022 and 2023. Dozens of people, scattered across the globe, reporting identical dreams of a city beneath ice. The descriptions varied in artistic detail, but the core elements were consistent: copper domes, crystal spires, a location in Siberia, and an overwhelming sense of urgency that it's time. The excavation team in Siberia, Mikhail revealed, wasn't assembled by governments or corporations. It was assembled by people who'd had these dreams. They pooled their resources, obtained the necessary permits under false pretenses, and started digging where the dreams told them to dig. and they found it. What lies beneath the ice? The leaked photograph from the Siberian excavation site showed only the uppermost portion of the dome, roughly 3 meters of copper and crystal architecture emerging from the ice like the tip of an iceberg. But according to ground-penetrating radar, what lay beneath was staggering. In scale, the structure extended at least 200 meters down into the earth, far deeper than the permafrost layer, suggesting it had either been buried deliberately or had been standing when the climate was radically different. The complex covered approximately 15 square kilometers, making it larger than any ancient city ever discovered, and most impossibly, it was still generating heat. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a geothermal specialist who was brought in for consultation and who later leaked information to the research team, described what the scans revealed. The entire structure is radiating energy at a steady temperature of approximately 20 degrees Celsius, room temperature. This is coming from somewhere inside the complex, not from geothermal sources. We've confirmed that there's no volcanic activity in the region, no hot springs, nothing that would explain a sustained heat signature. The structure itself is producing energy. When the excavation team finally created an access point and sent down a camera drone, the footage, fragments of which were leaked online before being scrubbed, showed corridors and chambers in pristine condition. No collapse, no deterioration. The copper fixtures still gleamed. The crystal elements still refracted light in complex patterns. And perhaps most eerily, the lights were on. Not electric lights as we know them, Tanaka explained. The illumination seems to come from the walls themselves, or rather from the interaction between the copper, crystal, and some energy source we haven't identified yet. The entire structure is softly glowing, as if it's been waiting. The team found inscriptions, not in any known language, but in geometry. IC symbols that matched patterns Anastasia had described in her testimony. Dr. Chen, when shown these symbols, recognized them immediately. These are frequency maps. Each symbol represents a specific electromagnetic frequency. Strung together, they form what I can only describe as musical notation for consciousness. Instructions, perhaps, or historical records encoded not in words but in resonance patterns. But it was the central chamber that confirmed Mikhail's account of what Anastasia had revealed. The camera drone entered a vast spherical room, approximately 50 meters in diameter, lined entirely with a lattice of copper and crystal. In the center, suspended by some mechanism the team couldn't immediately explain, was a sphere of what appeared to be liquid metal, rotating slowly, generating a visible field distortion around it. It's a consciousness amplifier, Dr. Chen concluded after analyzing the footage. The entire chamber is designed to create a standing wave pattern that would synchronize the brain waves of everyone inside it. The rotating sphere is likely generating a powerful electromagnetic field that entrains neural activity to specific frequencies. This is technology we're only beginning to theorize about in cutting-edge neuroscience labs, and they built it over a century ago, possibly much longer. The excavation team wanted to enter the chamber physically, but when they approached within 10 meters of the entrance, every member experienced the same phenomenon: vivid flashes of images, voices speaking in unknown languages, overwhelming emotional surges ranging from profound peace to intense urgency. Several team members collapsed. 2 had to be evacuated due to severe disorientation. It's still active, Dr. Chen explained, and it's responding to human presence. Whatever this technology does, it's not dormant. It's been waiting down there, preserved in ice, maintaining itself, ready to activate the moment someone approaches. This is when the governments got involved. The excavation team had been operating under permits for geological research. But once the footage leaked and the true nature of the discovery became apparent, Russian military forces moved in. The site was seized within 48 hours. The team was detained, their equipment confiscated, the entire area declared a military zone with a 50-kilometer exclusion radius. But the information was already out. Fragmented, incomplete, but enough to confirm what the 3 researchers had been investigating. Mikhail Volkov's testimony was real. Anastasia's deathbed confession was accurate, and the biggest secret she'd revealed, that there was a functioning Tartarian consciousness amplification complex hidden beneath Siberia, was now confirmed. Except Mikhail had told the researchers there was something else. Something even Anastasia had only hinted at. Something that terrified her more than the erasure of her civilization, more than the suppression of free energy, more than the century of lies and cover-ups. She told Mikhail that the buried complex wasn't empty, it was occupied, and whatever was inside had been waiting a very long time for someone to open the door. The Guardians, according to Mikhail's account of Anastasia's final testimony, when the Tartarian elders realized their civilization was being systematically destroyed, they faced an impossible choice. They possessed knowledge and technology that could transform human civilization, but humanity, in their assessment, wasn't ready for it. The very forces destroying Tartaria proved that point, people with access to power but without the wisdom to use it responsibly. My grandmother said the elders held a final council in 1867, Mikhail recounted. Representatives came from all across the Tartarian territories, traveling in secret, knowing many wouldn't survive the journey back. They debated for weeks. Some argued they should share everything openly, force the knowledge into the world before it could be completely suppressed. Others said humanity needed to evolve naturally, that giving them advanced technology prematurely would be like giving weapons to children. They reached a compromise, Mikhail continued. They would preserve everything, the technology, the knowledge, the consciousness amplification techniques. But they would seal it away, and they would leave guardians, people who would voluntarily enter a state of suspended consciousness, maintaining the complex, waiting for the moment when humanity was ready to receive what had been preserved. The three researchers were skeptical. Dr. Webb voiced what they were all thinking: suspended consciousness for over 150 years? That's not possible. Not with our current understanding of biology, Dr. Chen interjected thoughtfully. But if their consciousness technology was as advanced as the evidence suggests, if they truly could interface directly with electromagnetic fields, consciousness doesn't require a metabolically active body. It's an electromagnetic phenomenon. If you could transfer consciousness into a stable field pattern, maintain it within the structure itself, you're describing people uploading their minds into the building, Hoffman said incredulously. I'm describing exactly what Anastasia claimed the Guardians did, Chen replied. They didn't die. They didn't freeze themselves cryogenically. They transferred their consciousness into the electromagnetic field generated by the structure itself, becoming part of it, maintaining it, waiting. Mikhail nodded slowly. My grandmother said there were 12 of them. 12 master knowledge keepers who volunteered to become what she called the Watchers in the Field. She knew 3 of them personally: teachers, healers, architects. She said saying goodbye to them was the hardest thing she ever did because they were choosing a fate none of them fully understood. They would exist in a state between life and death, aware but disembodied, present but untouchable, for however long it took. And the trigger for their awakening? Webb asked. The same trigger that led to the discovery of the complex, Mikhail explained. When human collective consciousness reached a critical threshold, when enough minds started resonating at frequencies compatible with Tartarian technology, the Guardians would sense it. They would begin calling out, sending signals that sensitive individuals would interpret as dreams, visions, compulsions to search. The discovery wasn't accidental. It was orchestrated from within the complex itself. This explains something that had puzzled Dr. Chen from the beginning. The reports from the excavation team, the disorientation when they approached the central chamber. They weren't just experiencing random electromagnetic effects. They were encountering consciousness. The Guardians were trying to communicate. What were they trying to say? Hoffman asked. Mikhail pulled out a notebook, one of the few things Anastasia had kept hidden for 70 years. She wrote down phonetic transcriptions of words she heard in the last moments of lucidity before they sealed the complex. She didn't understand them at the time. She was just a child, traumatized, watching people she loved disappear into the machinery. But she remembered them. He showed them the pages. The words were written in Cyrillic characters, but they didn't form Russian words. Dr. Chen photographed the pages. Despite the no devices rule, she'd smuggled in a film camera, and later spent weeks trying to decode them. When she finally succeeded, using frequency analysis and electromagnetic pattern matching, the message was clear. We wait for the awakening. We hold the bridge. We are the memory of what was and the seed of what must be. When you find us, do not fear. We are you, from a time when humanity remembered itself. The complex will teach you, but only if you come with open minds and unified purpose. Division will destroy you as it destroyed us. Unity will elevate you as it was meant to elevate us. The choice is yours, as it has always been. We are merely the guardians of the path. You must walk it yourselves." The implications were staggering. If the guardians were real, if consciousness could indeed be preserved and maintained within electromagnetic fields, then the central chamber wasn't just a room. It was a meeting place, a place where human consciousness could interface directly with these ved minds, accessing knowledge and wisdom accumulated over centuries or possibly millennia. But there was a problem. The Russian military had seized the site. No independent researchers were being allowed anywhere near it. And according to leaked intelligence that Dr. Webb received from a source in the European intelligence community, the Russians weren't planning to study the complex peacefully. "They're trying to weaponize it," Webb revealed grimly. "They've brought in military neurologists, electromagnetic weapons specialists, consciousness researchers from their classified programs. They're not interested in learning from the Guardians. They want to extract the technology, reverse engineer it, and turn it into a weapon." "What kind of weapon?" Hoffman asked, horrified. "Think about it," Chen replied, her face pale. "If you could amplify and synchronize consciousness, you could potentially control large populations. You could broadcast thoughts, emotions, compulsions. You could create absolute loyalty, suppress dissent, erase memories. This technology, in the wrong hands, would make every totalitarian regime in history look primitive by comparison." Mikhail closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked every one of his 92 years. "This is why my grandmother was afraid. This is why she said the knowledge could only be released when the time was right, because the same technology that could elevate humanity could also enslave it. And she absolutely knew, that people would try to weaponize it." "Is there any way to stop them?" Webb asked. "There might be," Mikhail said quietly. "But it requires something my grandmother gave me, something I haven't shown anyone until now. Element 5, the key in the test." From an inner pocket of his jacket, Mikhail withdrew a small object wrapped in aged cloth. As he unwrapped it, the three researchers leaned forward. It was the carved meteorite stone, the symbol of the Tartarian knowledge keepers that Anastasia had given her grandson in her final moments. But Mikhail revealed that it wasn't just a symbol, it was a key. "My grandmother explained that the complex has safeguards," Mikhail said, holding the stone carefully. "The Guardians designed it so that the technology couldn't be accessed by force or deception. You can't break in, you can't hack it, you can't reverse engineer it through brute force analysis. The complex itself is conscious, or at least responsive to consciousness in specific ways. It recognizes intent." He turned the stone over, showing them details they hadn't noticed in the photographs. The carved geometric pattern wasn't just decorative, it was three-dimensional, with subtle variations in depth that created a complex topography. "This pattern is a consciousness signature, a specific frequency pattern encoded in physical form. When held by someone with the right intent, genuine desire to learn and grow rather than control and dominate, it resonates. That resonance can be detected by the complex." "You're saying it's like a biometric lock, but for consciousness?" Chen asked, fascinated despite herself. "Exactly," Mikhail confirmed. "The Russians can occupy the site. They can bring all the equipment they want, but they can't access the core technology without this. And even if they somehow replicated the stone, it wouldn't work unless held by someone with pure intent. The complex would remain sealed. But you have the key," Webb observed, "so you could access it." "I could," Mikhail acknowledged, "but my grandmother warned me that carrying the key makes me a target. She said that when the complex was discovered, those who wanted to weaponize it would come looking for the key. They would do anything to obtain it. And she was right. 3 weeks ago, my home was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but everything was searched. Someone knew what they were looking for." He looked at each researcher in turn. "She also told me that the key wouldn't work for just anyone. The complex requires something she called the test of unity. The key must be carried by someone who comes not alone but with others who share unified purpose. Division, ego, hidden agendas, these create dissonance that the complex will detect and reject. But true collaboration, genuine collective intention to use the knowledge wisely, that creates a resonance that the complex will recognize. That's why I agreed to meet you three," Mikhail continued. Separately, you each discovered pieces of the truth. Together, you've been working to understand the full picture, not for personal gain, but because you recognized something profound was being hidden. My grandmother's message, the frequency encoded in my consciousness, passed down from hers, told me I could trust you. Dr. Chen was the first to understand the full implication. You want us to go to Siberia, to somehow get past the military cordon and access the complex. Not just access it, Mikhail corrected. My grandmother said the Guardians have been waiting to pass on their knowledge, but only to those who prove themselves worthy through the test. The test isn't a puzzle or a challenge in the traditional sense. It's an evaluation of consciousness itself. When you enter the central chamber with the key, the Guardians will interface with your minds directly. They'll see your memories, your motivations, your fears, your hopes. They'll see who you truly are, beneath the masks and roles you show the world. And if we fail this test, Hoffman asked quietly, then the complex remains sealed, and the knowledge is lost, Mikhail said. Worse, you might be lost too. My grandmother said the interface is overwhelming. Your consciousness exposed completely, every secret revealed, every lie undone. Some minds can't handle that level of truth about themselves. They fracture. The few people who attempted to enter the complex before it was sealed, people who came with selfish intent or hidden agendas, never came out. Their bodies did, but their minds were gone. The room fell silent. The enormity of what Mikhail was suggesting settled over them like a weight. He was asking them to risk not just their lives, but their sanity, their very sense of self, to access knowledge that might already be inaccessible, guarded by a military cordon in one of the most remote regions on Earth. Why us? Webb finally asked. Why not someone with political power, military resources, the ability to actually do something with this knowledge on a global scale? Mikhail smiled sadly. Because people with that kind of power are exactly who can't pass the test. Power corrupts consciousness. It creates attachment, ego, the belief that you know better than others, that you have the right to decide for humanity. The Guardians won't accept that. They're looking for people who seek knowledge not to wield power, but to share wisdom. People who understand that this technology isn't meant to elevate individuals, it's meant to elevate all of humanity together. He placed the stone on the table between them. My grandmother told me that when the time came, the key would choose its carriers, that I would know who was meant to attempt the test. I'm 92 years old. I don't have many years left, and I certainly don't have the strength for what needs to be done. But you three, you're young enough, dedicated enough, and most importantly, you've already proven you can work together across disciplines and borders for the sake of truth. The choice is yours, Mikhail said. Take the key and attempt to reach the complex. Face the test and potentially access knowledge that could transform human civilization. Or leave it here, let the Russians eventually break through the safeguards. Because they will, eventually, even if it takes decades. And let them be the ones to decide how this technology is used. Dr. Chen reached out, her hand hovering over the stone. If we do this, if we somehow succeed, what then? How do we share what we learn? How do we prevent it from being weaponized? That's part of the test, Mikhail replied. The Guardians won't just evaluate whether you're worthy to receive the knowledge. They'll evaluate whether humanity is ready. If you pass, if the knowledge is transmitted, you'll understand how it must be shared. My grandmother said the wisdom comes with the technology. You can't separate them. You can't learn how to build consciousness amplifiers without also learning why division and control are incompatible with their use. It's designed to be self-limiting, Chen realized. Anyone who learns how to build it will also understand that using it for control or dominance would destroy its function. It only works through voluntary unity. Exactly, Mikhail confirmed. That's why the Tartarians were destroyed. Not because their technology was dangerous, but because their technology made domination impossible. In a world where consciousness could be shared freely, where intentions were transparent, where knowledge flowed without restriction, how could anyone maintain power through deception, secrecy, or force? The three researchers looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Dr. Webb spoke for all of them. When do we leave? The journey to the frozen truth. Planning the expedition took 3 months. Getting into Russia undetected required resources, connections, and a level of subterfuge that none of the researchers were comfortable with, but which they recognized as necessary. Dr. Webb's contacts in the intelligence community provided documentation, cover stories, and a route that would take them through Kazakhstan into Siberia, avoiding official checkpoints. The meteorite key was divided, not physically, but in terms of custody. Each of the three researchers memorized its exact measurements, its geometric patterns, its weight and composition. Then Mikhail had 3 replica created, perfect in every detail except one. They weren't carved from meteorite. The real key traveled with Dr. Chen, hidden in a diplomatic pouch that technically gave it immunity from search. The replicas served as decoys, carried by each researcher in case they were separated. They entered Russia in late May 2024, traveling separately with coordinated timing. Dr. Chen came as part of an academic exchange program, ostensibly to lecture at Novosibirsk State University. Klaus Hoffmann arrived as a consultant for a construction project in Yakutsk. Dr. Webb simply disappeared from his normal life, entering through the Kazakh border with forged credentials identifying him as a mining engineer. The rendezvous point was a small town called Mirny, built around a diamond mine, approximately 800 kilometers from the excavation site. It was close enough to serve as a staging ground, but far enough to avoid immediate suspicion. They met in a hotel room that Hoffmann had swept for surveillance devices, though all three knew that in modern Russia, true privacy was an illusion. The military exclusion zone extends 50 kilometers from the site in all directions, Webb reported, spreading maps across the bed. But the actual security presence is concentrated here. He pointed to the excavation site itself and along the main access roads. The rest is monitored by satellite and occasional patrols. Can we avoid the satellites? Chen asked. Not avoid, blend, Hoffmann said. The region has geological survey teams, environmental researchers, indigenous hunting parties. If we approach during the right window, carrying the right equipment, we'll look like just another research group. The key is timing and maintaining our cover until we're close enough that it doesn't matter. They spent 2 weeks preparing, acquiring equipment, establishing their cover story as a geological survey team studying permafrost degradation. The cover was solid enough to withstand casual scrutiny, but all three knew that if they were stopped and seriously questioned, it would fall apart. The approach began on June 15, 2024. They traveled in a reinforced truck built for Siberian conditions, their equipment including ground-penetrating radar, which they actually knew how to use, lending authenticity to their cover, camping gear, and enough supplies for 2 weeks. The meteorite key remained with Chen, now hidden in a false bottom of a equipment case containing rock samples. The first 3 days passed without incident. They made camp, performed actual geological surveys to maintain their cover, and slowly worked their way toward the exclusion zone. On the 4th day, they encountered their first patrol, a military vehicle with 4 soldiers who stopped them at a checkpoint that wasn't on any official map. The conversation was tense but professional. Hoffmann, who spoke fluent Russian, explained their research project. The soldiers examined their documents, asked questions about their findings, seemed genuinely curious about permafrost degradation. Chen noticed that the youngest soldier kept glancing at their equipment with the interest of someone scientifically inclined rather than suspicious. They were allowed to pass, but with a warning: you're approaching a restricted military zone. If you continue in this direction, you'll be turned back. Change your heading to northeast. They thanked the soldiers, drove northeast for an hour until they were out of sight, then circled back on a different trajectory. This pattern repeated twice more over the next 3 days. Encounters with patrols, course corrections, dual approach from different angles. They were getting closer, but time was running out. Their provisions would last another week at most, and the longer they remained in the area, the greater the chance their cover would be blown. On the 8th day, they got lucky. A severe storm moved in, not unusual for the region, even in June. Visibility dropped to near zero, and satellite surveillance would be useless. The patrols would hunker down, waiting out the weather. It was the window they needed. They abandoned the truck, loaded essential equipment onto sleds, and began the final approach on foot. The storm was brutal, winds that cut through their gear, snow that made every step a battle. But it also provided perfect cover. For 18 hours, they pushed forward, navigating by GPS and compass, making painfully slow progress through conditions that would have turned back any reasonable expedition. When the storm finally broke, they were 4 kilometers from the excavation site, close enough to see the lights of the military encampment, close enough to see the massive structure rising from the ice, far more of it exposed now than in the leaked photographs. The excavation had progressed significantly. 3 of the domes were now fully uncovered, and heavy equipment surrounded what appeared to be an access shaft leading down into the complex. "We're not getting in through the main entrance," Webb observed, studying the site through binoculars. "Too much activity, too many guards." "The complex extends for 15 square kilometers," Chen reminded them. "There have to be other access points, using the ground-penetrating radar." And here, their actual expertise became crucial. A began mapping the subsurface structure. It took 3 hours of careful scanning, moving position every 20 minutes to avoid detection, but eventually, they found what they were looking for. A secondary shaft, approximately 2 kilometers from the main excavation, covered by only 5 meters of ice and earth. "We can dig through that," Hoffman assessed. 2 days, maybe 3 if we work carefully and manage not to attract attention. They set up camp in a depression that hid them from casual observation, arranged their equipment to look like a legitimate research station from above, and began to dig. The work was exhausting, chipping through permafrost by hand, removing debris, creating a shaft just wide enough for a person to descend. They worked in shifts, 2 digging while 1 maintained watch, and kept up the appearance of normal research activity. On the second day, Chen's tools hit something that wasn't ice or rock. Something smooth, something metallic. They'd reached the complex. Now came the most dangerous part, actually entering it, without knowing what security measures might still be active, without knowing if the Guardians would recognize them as worthy, without knowing if Mikhail's key would actually work. Dr. Chen reached into her pack and withdrew the meteorite stone. In the dim light of the Arctic summer night, its carved patterns seemed to shimmer with their own luminescence. "Are we ready for this?" she asked quietly. Klaus Hoffman and Marcus Webb looked at each other, then at her. They'd come too far, risked too much, to turn back now. Whatever lay below, whether it was the preserved wisdom of a lost civilization or their own destruction, they old face it together. "Let's find out what the Guardians have been waiting to tell us," Webb said. They began their descent into the complex, the chamber of consciousness. The shaft they dug opened into what appeared to be a maintenance corridor, narrow, lined with the same copper and crystal architecture visible in the leaked footage, dimly glowing with that sourceless light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The temperature was comfortable, approximately 20 degrees Celsius, despite being surrounded by permafrost. The air was fresh, with a faint scent of ozone and something else, something Chen identified as the distinctive smell of ionization. "The whole structure is charged," she whispered, pulling out a small electromagnetic field detector. "We're walking through a live electrical field, but it's not like anything I've ever measured. The frequency it's pulsing, like a heartbeat." They moved forward carefully, following the corridor as it sloped downward. The walls were covered with the same geometric symbols Anastasia had described, patterns that seemed to shift and rearrange when viewed peripherally, but remained static when looked at directly. Hoffman ran his fingers along one and immediately pulled back with a gasp. "What is it?" Webb asked urgently. "I felt something," Hoffman said, staring at his hand. "Like a vibration, but also like a knowing. For a second I understood what the symbol meant, not intellectually but directly. And then it was gone. The complex is responding to us," Chen realized. "It's not passive architecture, it's interactive, designed to interface with consciousness." They continued deeper, and the core door began to widen, opening into larger chambers. Some appeared to be living spaces, rooms with fixtures that suggested furniture, though nothing remained except impressions in the floor where objects had once stood. Others were clearly functional. Chambers filled with complex arrangements of copper coils, crystal arrays, and geometric frameworks that Chen recognized as matching theoretical designs for electromagnetic field generators. "These are the systems that keep the complex running," she explained, photographing everything with her film camera. "Look at the elegance of the design. No wasted components, no inefficiency. It's like looking at a living organism, every part serving multiple functions, all integrated into a unified whole." They found what appeared to be a library, walls covered with storage alcoves, though the objects that had once occupied them were long gone. Webb ran his detector along the alcoves and found residual electromagnetic patterns. The information wasn't stored in books or physical media, he realized. It was encoded in the structure itself. These alcoves must have held crystals or some other medium that contained data as frequency patterns. Frequency storage, Chen confirmed. Information encoded as standing waves in crystalline matrices. Theoretically possible, but we've never successfully implemented it. Yet they were doing it over a century ago. The corridors all seemed to lead toward the center of the complex, and as they approached, the sense of presence, of being observed, evaluated, welcomed, and warned all at once, grew stronger. All three researchers felt it, though they experienced it differently. Chen felt it as a pressure in her mind, like someone gently touching her thoughts. Hoffman experienced it as emotions not quite his own, curiosity, hope, and an almost parental concern. Webb heard whispers in languages he didn't know but somehow partially understood, and then they reached it, the central chamber. It was exactly as shown in the leaked footage, but experiencing it in person was overwhelming in a way no video could capture. The spherical room, 50 meters in diameter, latticed with copper and crystal in patterns that created a dizzying sense of depth and dimensionality. The suspended sphere of liquid metal in the center, rotating slowly, generating visible distortions in the air around it, not heat shimmer, but something else, as if space itself was being bent. Standing at the entrance, all three felt their thoughts beginning to synchronize. Chen noticed she was having Webb's memory of his first encounter with the leaked footage. Hoffman was experiencing Chen's childhood fascination with electromagnetic phenomena. Webb was flooded with Hoffman's understanding of sacred geometry. Their individual consciousnesses were beginning to merge, blend, share. "The field is entraining our neural activity," Chen managed to say, though speaking felt strange, as if the words were coming from all of them simultaneously. "We need to stay focused on who we are, or we'll lose ourselves in the merge." But even as she said it, she understood that losing themselves might be exactly what was required. The Guardians weren't separate entities waiting in the chamber. They were the chamber, or at least they were patterns within its electromagnetic field. To communicate with them, to receive what they'd preserve, required temporarily surrendering individual identity and entering into unified consciousness. Dr. Chen pulled out the meteorite key. The moment it entered the chamber, the sphere's rotation accelerated, and the field intensity increased dramatically. Symbols began appearing in the air, not physical but perceptual, images forming directly in their minds. And with the symbols came understanding. The test wasn't a puzzle to solve or a challenge to overcome. It was simply a requirement to be completely vulnerably honest about who they were and why they'd come. The Guardians would see everything, every fear, every selfish thought, every moment of doubt, every private shame, but also every moment of courage, every sacrifice, every choice made for the good of others rather than personal gain. The three researchers looked at each other, a final moment of individual consciousness. Then, together, holding hands in an instinctive gesture of unity, they stepped into the field. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. Their minds opened like books, every page visible simultaneously. Chen felt Hoffman's grief over the destruction of beautiful buildings, his rage at waste and ignorance, his desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, humanity could do better. She felt Webb's loneliness as a historian who saw patterns others missed, his frustration at being dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, his determination to find truth regardless of personal cost. And they felt her fear that her work would be used to harm rather than help, her guilt over choosing career over family, her absolute conviction that knowledge should be free and shared, not hoarded and controlled. But than their individual thoughts and feelings, they experienced the Guardians. 12 distinct consciousnesses, so different from human minds that the contact was like touching an alien intelligence, yet so fundamentally human in their hopes and fears that the connection was immediate and profound. The Guardians had been waiting, not in stasis, not in sleep, but in active awareness, experiencing time in a way that made 150 years feel both like moments and like eternities. They'd watched through the complex's sensors as their civilization was destroyed, as the lies were written into history, as generations grew up never knowing what had been lost. They'd felt every researcher who'd gotten close to the truth, every seeker who'd sensed something was missing from the official story. They'd seen Anastasia grow old carrying their secret, watched Mikhail guard it faithfully, and now they were meeting those he'd chosen, and they were conducting the test, not asking questions, but simply observing. Seeing whether these three humans could handle truth without breaking, whether they could access knowledge without being corrupted by it, whether they could bear the weight of what they were about to receive. The judgment, when it came, wasn't in words or even in concepts. It was a feeling, a recognition, an acceptance, a sense of doors opening that had been closed for a very long time. The Guardians approved, the test was passed, and the transmission began. The truth that cannot be contained. What happened in the central chamber over the next 6 hours cannot be adequately described in words. Language is sequential, linear, built for conveying one thought at a time. But the transmission from the Guardians was simultaneous, holographic, multi-dimensional. Chen, Hoffman, and Webb experienced it not as learning but as remembering, as if the knowledge had always been within them, just waiting to be accessed. They understood the true history of Tartaria, not as Anastasia's fragmentary testimony had conveyed it, but completely, experiencing it as if they'd lived it themselves. They saw the civilization at its height, cities of impossible beauty where architecture, art, and technology were unified into a single expression of human potential. They felt what it was like to live in a world where energy was free, where knowledge flowed without restriction, where consciousness itself was evolving towards something greater. They witnessed the decision to destroy it, saw the meetings in Vienna, London, Washington, St. Petersburg, where powerful men recognized that Tartarian technology threatened everything they'd built their power upon. They saw the calculated campaign of erasure, the deliberate destruction, the rewriting of history, the suppression of knowledge, and they understood why it had worked, because most people didn't want to believe such a conspiracy was possible. It was easier to accept the official story than to confront the possibility that everything they'd been taught was a lie. But more importantly, they received the technical knowledge. They understood how the buildings worked, how to harness electromagnetic fields, how to create standing wave patterns that could generate unlimited clean energy. They learned the mathematics of consciousness, the frequencies that promoted healing, learning, unity. They discovered techniques for storing information in crystalline matrices, for encoding knowledge in geometric patterns, for building structures that would last millennia with minimal maintenance. And they learned why the Guardians had sealed it all away. Because the technology was inseparable from consciousness. You couldn't build an energy generator without understanding that you were part of a unified field. You couldn't create a consciousness amplifier without recognizing that individual ego was an illusion, a temporary coalescence of patterns that would eventually dissolve back into the greater whole. You couldn't access the knowledge without being fundamentally changed by it. This was the safeguard. The technology itself transformed anyone who truly understood it. It made domination impossible because it made the distinction between self and other obsolete. You couldn't use it to control people because using it required recognizing that there were no separate people to control. Only one consciousness experiencing itself through billions of perspectives. This is why they failed, Hoffman understood. Speaking aloud, though speech felt unnecessary in the merged state. Everyone who tried to weaponize Tartarian technology throughout history failed, not because the technology didn't work, but because understanding how it works makes weaponization impossible. It's self-limiting, Chen agreed. The more you comprehend it, the less you want to use it for control. The knowledge comes with wisdom built in. But will they accept that? Webb asked, thinking of the Russian military, the governments, the power structures that had spent over a century suppressing this truth. When we share what we've learned, will they allow it to spread, or will they try to suppress it again? The Guardians responded, and their answer was complex. They showed the three researchers a vision, not of the future because consciousness doesn't predict, but of possibility. They saw two paths. In one, the knowledge was shared openly. The three researchers published everything. The technical specs, the mathematics, the historical evidence, the testimony from the Guardians themselves. At first they would be dismissed, attacked, ridiculed. But the knowledge would spread. Others would verify it, replicate it, improve upon it. Within a generation, the entire energy infrastructure of human civilization would transform. Within 2, consciousness itself would begin to shift. Within 3, the old systems of power through control and scarcity would collapse, unable to maintain themselves in a world where separation was recognized as illusion. But this path required sacrifice. Those who currently held power would fight desperately to prevent it. Some of the researchers who worked to spread the knowledge would be silenced. The transition would be chaotic, possibly violent, definitely traumatic. Society would have to completely reorganize itself. Many would resist, preferring the familiar chains of the old world to the terrifying freedom of the new. In the other path, the knowledge remained hidden. The 3 researchers would keep what they'd learned to themselves, share it only with a select few, build in work gradually. This path was safer, less disruptive, but it was also slower, incomplete. Without open sharing, the knowledge would remain limited, controlled, filtered through hierarchies of secrecy. It might take centuries to achieve what could be done in decades, and there was no guarantee it wouldn't be suppressed again. They're asking us to choose, Webb realized. No, Chen corrected, her perception sharpened by the merged consciousness. They're showing us that the choice has always been ours. Theirs was to preserve the knowledge. Anastasia's was to keep it alive long enough to reach us. Mikhail's was to find people worthy of receiving it. Ours is to decide what to do with it. The Guardians pulsed agreement, and with it came a final transmission. Not knowledge this time, but a gift. They showed the 3 researchers how to carry what they'd learned, not in their conscious minds, which would be vulnerable to coercion, drugs, torture, or simple forgetfulness, but encoded in their neural patterns, accessible through specific meditative states, shareable through consciousness-to-consciousness contact. The knowledge couldn't be beaten out of them because they wouldn't consciously know they possessed it until they needed it. It couldn't be stolen because it could only be transferred voluntarily, through trust and open connection. It couldn't be suppressed because it would spread through the very fabric of human consciousness, invisible to those who still thought in terms of physical information and material control. They've made us carriers, Hoffman understood. Living libraries, like Anastasia was. We don't have to publish anything. We just have to connect with people, open ourselves to them, and the knowledge transfers naturally. Memetic engineering, Chen breathed. They've encoded the information as a consciousness virus, beneficial, non-coercive, but impossible to contain once it starts spreading. The Guardians confirmed and added one final message. Their time was ending. Maintaining consciousness within the field for 150 years had required resources, energy, and a kind of will that was finally exhausting itself. They'd waited for this moment, for worthy recipients of what they'd preserved, and now that the transmission was complete, they could finally rest. The 3 researchers felt the Guardians beginning to fade, their distinct personalities dissolving back into the unified field, then into something even more fundamental. It wasn't death. Consciousness doesn't die, it just transforms, returns to the source, rejoins the infinite. But it was an ending, and it was beautiful and terrible and necessary. Thank you, Chen whispered, speaking for all of them. We'll honor what you've preserved. The final pulse from the Guardians wasn't words or images, but pure feeling, gratitude, hope, love, and release. Then they were gone, and the central chamber fell silent, its light dimming as the systems that had maintained it for over a century began to finally power down. The 3 researchers stood there, still connected but separating now, becoming individuals again. They looked at each other with new eyes, seeing not just the people they'd known but the totality of who they were, what they de-experienced, what they now carried. We need to leave, Webb said practically, his historian's mind already planning. The military will have detected the power fluctuation. They'll investigate. They made their way back through the corridors, which now felt different. Dormant, sleeping, rather than alive. Behind them, the complex was entering a state of preservation. Its essential knowledge transferred, its guardians released, its purpose fulfilled. It would remain, a testament to what had been, but its active phase was over. They reached the surface just as dawn was breaking. Real dawn this time, not the half-light of Arctic summer. In the distance they could see activity at the military encampment, vehicles mobilizing, aircraft taking off. The Russians had detected something, were responding. But it was too late. The knowledge was out, not in documents or recordings that could be seized, but in 3 human minds, encoded in ways that made it part of their fundamental consciousness. They would return to the world, resume their normal lives, but everything would be different. They would connect with Otha.